So I think I'll leave it at there. I have a lot to say about the implications of the election, but you want to talk about what you think happened?
Sure. So I wasn't surprised at all. Many of you have been sat here in this room with me where I've spoken about global Trumpism and various things like this. The first time I came out publicly and said I thought that he would win was at a Watson event in May last year. I did an interview in Greece that went viral when I predicted both Brexit and Trump. And it's not because I have a clairvoyant crystal ball sitting under my bed or I made a pact with Satan to see the future in a mirror. It's simply, it's pretty obvious if you think about it in a more global way. This is not a local event. Everything that Professor Shillett just said is true about this election, but Brexit happened. There's a left-wing version of this that brought us Greece. There's the shrinkage of centre party votes across the entire OECD. There's the collapse of left-wing parties' votes, in particular, across Western Europe. Coming up next, Renzi is going to fail in Italy in the referendum that's coming up, which will cause a constitutional crisis in Italy. Shortly after that, we have the French election coming up. I would like to remind you of the following statistics. The lowest George Bush ever got, George Bush Jr. got as president in his approval rating was 29%. The president of France currently has an approval rating of 4%. And the National Front have nearly 40% of the intended vote. So even with the design of the French constitution, which makes it very difficult and you have to have a second round, etc., the most popular political party by a factor of 2 in France is the National Front. After that, we have the German elections coming up. Merkel is vulnerable. How is all of this going to play out, and what is it all connected? Here's a simple way of thinking about it. From 1945 until 1975, we targeted a particular economic variable called full employment. And there's a thing called the Lucas critique, which basically says if you keep targeting something, people will game it. And they did. Unions gamed it, employers gamed it, and the result was inflation. And after a while, that inflation became painful enough for the people who were hurt by it, who were the creditor classes in these countries, to band together and fund a market-friendly revolution. And they liberated finance, and they deregulated banks, and they integrated the economies of the world. And they globalized labor such that labor could no longer demand that it gets its share of productivity, because if you don't, I'll just move your job somewhere else. And all of those trade agreements that were signed, the globalization, which is inevitable and we can't roll back. You know, you can go on the web and type in WTO text, and you'll find that it's a very long 700-page legal agreement that took 5 years to thrash out between corporate interests, lawyers, lobbyists, with very little input from civil society. The same is true of the EU's agreements on capital movements, the banking union, take your pick. And there's a moment when people just began to figure out that for the past 30 years, going from 1985 until now, huge amounts of money have been generated in the global economy, and as we know from the work of Thomas Piketty and others, most of it's gone up to a tiny fraction of the population. So there's been a huge amount of growth, but hardly anyone's benefited. You don't have to go far to see this. Get off the east side. Go to the west side of Providence. Go to northwest Providence and walk into neighbourhoods which have cheque cashing agencies, fried chicken joints, pawn shops, broken down fix your mobile and networks you've never heard of stores. That's the reality for people, not just here, in many, many countries. So they're a bit fed up with this. And they've decided at any possible opportunity, whether it's Brexit, the Italian constitutional referendum or anything, to basically give their elites notice that we've had enough of this. And that's what this is. Now, there's a macroeconomic underpinning to this one too, because after we decided to target on full employment for 30 years, we decided to target inflation for 30 years. I don't see why the Lucas critique doesn't actually apply to that one as well. And we've managed to create a world in which you can dump 13 trillion euros into the global money supply through quantitative easing and other programs, and there's no inflation anywhere. And here's your problem. When you've levered up your banking system and bailed it out, dumped it on the public purse and said you need to cut that terrible debt, when people's personal balance sheets are still bloated from all the credit they took on in the 2000s, and they don't have wage growth and there's no inflation to ease the burden of the debt, then the creditors fight harder to get their money back. Whether it's the case of Germany versus the rest of the Eurozone, whether it's the form of the creditor class versus the debtor class, what we have everywhere are creditor-debtor standoffs. And those creditor-debtor standoffs take different forms. For the left, it takes the form of Podemos. For the right, it takes the form of the National Front. And for Trump, which has a weird coalition, which is of course sexist and of course racist and of course anti-immigrant and all the rest of it. But one part of it is, if you look at the states that really fell hard, the Rust Belt, it's economic. Now, if you recognise that simple fact, you can put Trump in there with Brexit, you can put Trump in there with Jeremy Corbyn, you can put him in with all the rest of it. And I'll leave you one set of numbers that I found today, which I think is just an absolute clanger for this whole thing. In 2015, Wall Street bonuses, not regular compensation, bonuses, 7 years after they were bailed out with the public purse, totaled, when I get this right, $28.4 billion. Total compensation paid to every single person in this country who earns a minimum wage, $14 billion. I'll stop there.
Okay. So I want to give,
I think the Wall Street issue goes much deeper than this. If you download from WikiLeaks the Podesta emails and start searching for place names, something very interesting happens. One of the place names that comes up the most is Martha's Vineyard. Another one that comes up after that is Davos. Another one that comes after that is Washington, D.C. And then basically the distribution of real places where real people actually live disappears into the tail. We talk about the Democrats, the Democratic Party. I don't know who that is. I know that there's a bunch of people who have made very, very nice six-figure careers in D.C., bouncing from agency to agency, starting wars, getting promoted, never actually paying the costs for it, waiting for the next administration to give them another pay hike. And I see a lot of that, and you just spend any time in D.C. and you bump into them all the time. Let me read you a little bit from what Thomas Frank had to say about this today in The Guardian. There's an even larger problem here. There's a kind of chronic complacency that's been rotting American liberalism for years. A hubris that tells Democrats they need do nothing different. They need deliver nothing to anyone, really, except their friends on the Google jet and those nice people at Goldman. The rest of us are treated as though we have nowhere else to go and no role to play except to vote enthusiastically on the grounds that these Democrats are the last thing standing between us and the end of the world. It's a liberalism of the rich, and it's failed the middle class, and it's failed in terms of its own electability. Enough with these comfortable Democrats and their cosy Washington system. Enough with Clintonism and its prideful air of professional class virtue. Enough. That's coming from a left commentator, not a right commentator. So I'm not even sure who the Democrats are that are going to mount this challenge, who the people that they're going to connect with, the social organizations, the movements, the youth. How do they touch them when they barely only talk to each other and no one else on the way out to Davos or Martha's Vineyard to commune with the guys at Goldman that are funding the party? Let's talk a few other consequences. In the summer, if you weren't paying close attention to American politics, or if you're a European, I got quite a few calls from Europeans, friends of mine from email, and they would say, why are you guys obsessed with bathrooms? Because it seems that Obama's legacy, from an outside point of view, now of course I get what's going on here, right? You're basically saying states cannot decide who persons are. This is actually an incredibly important issue, but it's done about bathrooms and who gets to go to a bathroom, right? Now let's think about people who really don't have the time or the inkling to figure out that this is actually a really important civil rights issue. It sounds ridiculous. And so much of what Democrats spend their time on might be good, but sounds ridiculous. And let's think about what Obama's actually doing for his legacy. You know, they were saying that he was going to ram TTIP through a lame duck session of Congress? A free trade agreement. You know that thing that lots of people are upset about? Let's go to Europe for a minute. Zygmunt Gabriel, the head of the Social Democrats. I was at his shop 3 weeks ago. I said, where's Zygmunt? He was in Wallonia campaigning for a free trade agreement with Canada. This is the head of the Social Democratic Party. When their job is carrying water for corporations to get investor protection treaties and then going out to commune with Goldman where the money is, why would you believe in them? I think the credibility problem here is absolutely enormous. Now, let's think about other things that have happened in the past that we have responsibility for that we never think about. The financial crisis, the Commodity Futures Modernisation Act, the deliberate discount of any information that anything to do with banks and finance wasn't good. The idea that we can't prick asset bubbles because we don't really know they're asset bubbles. Really? My dead cat Biggie knew there was a housing bubble and he didn't have a PhD in economics. So we're left with a technocracy and a bunch of political people who don't recognize politics, who are unwilling to engage in politics, because they'd love to think that everything's just a policy problem to be slide ruled out of existence. So let's think about the short-term consequences, a bit longer one here. So knowing that this was going to happen, I had shorts on in the market. So I was short US dollar and I was short S&P 500. But on Friday I took the shorts off because I started to think about, well, hang on a second. Let's say he wins. For me to make any money off this, because I don't have billions of dollars to play with and I can't afford to take leverage in the wrong direction, how am I going to do this with my paltry little bit of a gamble? Well, if you think about the companies that are going to benefit from Trump, there's actually a lot of them, and they disproportionately weight the S&P 500. So banks. Now, why are banks going to start loving this? Because Dodd-Frank is going to die. That much is clear. Healthcare companies, they're going to love it because Obamacare is going to die. Infrastructure companies are going to love it because we are going to spend money on that, and we're going to be able to do it because we're going to do it in the form of tax cuts, which is going to bloat the deficit and is going to be negative on US bonds. But it doesn't matter because there's nowhere else to go except the US dollar unless you want to buy German bonds that are already negatively yielding, so we will export our problems to the rest of the world as we usually do. So in the short term, you can tell a story that makes sense as to why today, after this guy gets elected, the
stock
US...
market's up.
Not just the stock market's up, all the indexes are up, and the US dollar is up. And that's after we elected that guy. So you want to think about consequences, you've got to think very hard about exactly how this plays out. A couple of other things going to happen. There's going to be a tax deal with US corporations. They're going to get a sweetheart deal. They'll probably pay a 10% penalty rate bringing back their taxes. After that, everybody's happy because they win and we slightly win. What will we use that money to do? To basically balance the books on the tax cuts that we're going to give, and they're already going to go once again to the overwhelmingly well-off. Second thing that's going to happen, as I've said, Obamacare's gone, Dodd-Frank is gone. What does that mean? It means we're going to start generating excessive leverage in the financial sector again. And there's a real problem here, which is, I'm not going to go into now, but happy answering the question and answer. There's a huge move into passive modes of investment, basically not active management. And there's a strategy called smart beta strategies, which people are pursuing, which is increasing massive amounts of correlation in financial markets again. And if you push leverage into that system, you basically create 2008 all over again. And the last one that I want to talk about is a domestic one, is both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have been equally dishonest on this. There is no renaissance of manufacturing in the United States.
Right.
It's not going to happen. At the end of the day, manufacturing works in a very simple way. Capital substitutes for labour at the margin. And the more capital you have, the less labour you need. Look at German Mittelstand. Unemployment's going like this. Output's going like this. We live in a world where literally 10% of the global population could provide superabundance for everyone. We have a distributional problem and a political problem. We do not have a problem of where you're going to make your stuff in factories. The notion that we're going to rebuild all these factories, the plant suppliers, the equipment manufacturers, what, so that people can get lung disease and asbestosis again? Is that actually the plan? I think this is tremendously dishonest to say that's going to happen. And then finally on foreign policy, I mentioned that the Italians are going to be in trouble soon. The French could really be in trouble. There's a whole host of things going on, German elections coming up. I used to worry about the future of the euro so much so that I wrote a book about it. I don't worry about the euro. I think that stays. I worry about the EU itself. I think that is desperately unstable and desperately fragile because it rests upon a technocratic consensus that the Commission can run things and the ECB is the best one to run economic policy, and nobody buys that anymore. So the legitimacy gap is absolutely huge and the performance gap is absolutely huge. And the final one, your friend and mine, Vladimir Putin. Because on the one hand, and this is where I will actually go very much with Professor Schiller here, I actually think that the, let's call them the neoliberal but nonetheless humanist, internationalist, interventionist Democrats who've been running foreign policy for the past decade and a half have been an absolute disaster. They haven't solved Iraq. They continue to do the same things. They're still blowing up Afghanistan. There's no end in sight. We're dropping drones on people without responsibility or oversight. This isn't going anywhere. So if anybody, they're also incredibly hostile to Russia. They've expanded all the way, NATO all the way up to the borders. You've given tiny little states in the Baltic F-15 fighters just to piss them off. You're putting radar installations to look for non-existent missiles from the Middle East coming from Iran. And then you've got Putin on the other side of that. So in the short term, taking that off the table might actually not be bad. That's why they're delighted. But here's your long-term problem. What if Donald thinks he's a super smart guy and he's got a good deal with Vladimir and everything's going on, and Vladimir says, haha, watch this, and he invades the Baltics? What does he do then? There's your risk factor. Consequence of that.
Yeah,